Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving into a fascinating Supreme Court case that perfectly illustrates a massive tug-of-war in the legal system. On one side, you have the aggressive fight against corruption. On the other, the fundamental, constitutionally enshrined presumption of innocence. We're looking at the case of People v. Rufino Pablo Palabrica III, and we'll be breaking down the exact case doctrines the highest court used to make their final decision.
Listen to this powerful quote from Justice Garland. This hooks us right into the core tension of our entire analysis today. Think about it. If a town mayor signs a market stall lease and a business permit for his very own pharmacy, is that automatically graft? Does the end goal of fighting corruption justify assuming someone's guilt right out of the gate? Well, as you'll see, the Supreme Court says absolutely not.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the mayor's dilemma, break down the elements of the crime, define actual intervention, figure out what exactly a transaction is, and finally, look at the strict interpretation of penal laws. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Mayor's Legal Dilemma, a tale of two charges. So, setting the scene, let's look at the factual background that actually led to the charges against Mayor Rufino Pablo Palabrica III of Dingle, Iloilo. He wasn't just a mayor, he was also a licensed physician who happened to own a medical clinic and a pharmacy right there in his town.
Because of this, he ended up facing two totally distinct charges under the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act. The first charge? Entering into a market stall lease where he effectively signed for the lessor, meaning the municipality, and as the lessee for his clinic. The second charge was for granting a business permit to his own pharmacy.
If we look at the actual legal text from the decision, we can see these charges started with a complaint to the ombudsman, which eventually led to a conviction by the Sandigan Bayan. If you're not familiar, that's the special appellate court in the Philippines that tries public officers. They found him guilty, sentenced him to prison, and perpetually disqualified him from public office. But the mayor didn't stop there. He appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court.
Section 2. Elements of the crime under Section 3H of RA No. 3019. To really grasp why the Supreme Court completely reversed that conviction, we need to systematically examine the specific elements of this anti-graft law.
For a violation to stick, the prosecution absolutely has to prove three mandatory elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Number 1, you are a public officer. Number 2, you have a direct or indirect financial interest in a business or transaction. And number 3, you intervene or take part in your official capacity in connection with that interest.
Now, the Supreme Court actually agreed with the lower court that the legal information filed was perfectly valid. The first two elements were clearly present, no question. Palabrica was undoubtedly the mayor, and he 100% owned the pharmacy and clinic, meaning he undeniably had a financial interest. So the entire case and his whole future really hinged on the legal interpretation of that third element.
Section 3. Defining actual intervention in the lease case. How exactly did the court approach that third element for the first charge? Did the mayor actually intervene in his official capacity to secure this market lease for himself?
The court looked at the facts and noticed something crucial. He'd actually been leasing this exact space since 1997, which was way before he ever became mayor. The 2014 contract in question, it was just a standard renewal with the exact same terms as the old ones. Plus, his signing was done with explicit authorization from the town council, who literally passed a resolution authorizing him to enter into lease contracts. There was absolutely zero evidence he asked for favors or got any special treatment.
And here is where a major case doctrine comes into play. How does the court define actual intervention? Legally, it means abusing your power or using dominant influence to get your way. Merely signing a pre-authorized, completely standard renewal document on behalf of the municipality, which is a duty mandated by his office anyway, doesn't constitute criminal intervention. Because there was no proof of undue influence, the court acquitted him of that first charge right then and there.
Section 4. What is a transaction? Let's pivot to the permit case. We're going to look at the second charge regarding the business permit and see how this builds into an incredibly intriguing question of statutory interpretation. The legal doctrines here get really fascinating.
See, the Sandigan Bayan had originally convicted him on this second charge because they considered issuing a business permit to be a transaction under the law. They interpreted the word super broadly, but the Supreme Court hit the brakes. They took a step back and looked at the exact wording of the statute, which forbids having an interest in any business, contract, or transaction.
This brilliantly illustrates the legal doctrine of noscitur associis, which is just a fancy Latin way of saying it is known by its associates.
or simply judging a word by the company it keeps. When a word in a law is a bit ambiguous, courts look at the words immediately surrounding it to figure out what the legislature actually intended.
Since transaction is rubbing shoulders with business and contract in the statute, its meaning is restricted by them. A business and a contract inherently involve monetary consideration, right? It's an exchange of value for profit. Therefore, a transaction under this specific law must also involve a monetary consideration. A standard business permit is just a regulatory exercise of police power. It's not a commercial trade or a contract between the government and the permittee. Because it completely lacks that monetary commercial consideration, a permit is not a transaction under this specific penal law.
Section 5. Interpreting penal laws strictly. This leads us to the overarching doctrine and perhaps the most important legal philosophy applied by the courts in this entire explainer.
You can really clearly see the contrast in approaches here. On one hand, you have the Sending and Byon's liberal interpretation, expanding the word transaction broadly to cover even regulatory permits, just to catch a potential conflict of interest. But the Supreme Court applied a strict, restrictive construction, limiting transaction only to agreements involving money, like a commercial contract.
So, why did the Supreme Court take this strict route? Well, it comes down to a bedrock legal doctrine: penal laws, the laws that literally send people to prison, are always construed strictly against the state and liberally in favor of the accused. The court firmly established that penal laws cannot be strained, extended, or enlarged by analogies to suddenly create a new offense out of thin air. If the legislature wanted to criminalize the issuance of a business permit under this specific section, they should have explicitly written it down. Since there's ambiguity, the tie always goes to the accused.
There's a quote from the ruling that perfectly captures this. Whatever is not plainly within the provisions of a penal statute should be regarded as without its intendment. This means courts simply cannot bring cases within the provision of a law if they aren't explicitly embraced by it. And to be clear, this isn't about letting guilty people off on a technicality. It's about demanding precise definitions of forbidden acts, vigorously reinforcing that presumption of innocence we talked about at the very beginning of the explainer.
Ultimately, the mayor was acquitted on both counts because the Supreme Court refused to stretch the definitions of intervention and transaction beyond their strict legal boundaries. We leave you with this final thought summarizing the core tension of today's analysis. No matter how much we genuinely want to fight corruption, should we ever punish someone if the strict wording of the law doesn't explicitly forbid their specific act? Thanks for joining us on this explainer, and keep questioning the details.